Attention! Max Verstappen, the king of Baku in previous years, has shocked everyone with a much lower than expected start in practice for the Azerbaijan Grand Prix. What's going on at Red Bull? But beware, what seemed like a simple bad day could hide more serious problems with the RB21. Before we continue, let me know your opinion in the comments. Do you think Verstappen will be able to turn the weekend around? Because what we're seeing in the data could change everything for Max. In this video, we'll analyze in detail how Max Verstappen fared in the first 2 free practices in Baku, why he finished so far from the lead, and what this reveals about the true state of the Red Bull RB21 at this critical stage of the season. The start to the weekend in Baku couldn't have been more complex for Max Verstappen and Red Bull. From the first practice session, it was clear that the RB21 wasn't performing as expected on a track that had historically favored the Dutchman. Finishing 7th on the timesheets, with a time that left him more than a second behind Lando Norris, not only surprised fans, but also set off alarm bells within the Austrian team's own garage. In Formula One, such a difference isn't simply an isolated statistic, but a sign that the car has structural problems that are difficult to mask. Most striking was that Verstappen didn't seem to have confidence in the car's performance from the opening laps. The driver reported on the radio that the car was unpredictable, unable to maintain a clear line through the 90-degree corners of the Old Town. In these technical sections, where surgical precision is required, the Dutchman found himself with a car that was moving more than usual, entering with understeer and exiting with oversteer. This combination not only sapped his speed, it also forced him to drive defensively, unusual for someone accustomed to attacking every inch of the track. Furthermore, the session was marked by a red flag that lasted more than 25 minutes due to problems with the curbs at turn 16. This interruption was no small feat. It completely disrupted the team's work plan and reduced the time available to experiment with setups. For a car already suffering from aerodynamic imbalances, losing that valuable time further limited Red Bull's ability to react. The result was that Verstappen and his engineers were left with a large amount of inconclusive data and the feeling that the margin for improvement was narrower than expected. In this context, what seemed like a poor start became a clear reflection of the RB21's profound difficulties. It wasn't just a bad lap or a green track in the early stages of the weekend, but a pattern that confirmed that Baku didn't suit the car. That early conclusion set the tone for the rest of the day and raised a key question. Would Red Bull be able to find quick solutions to give Max a competitive car in qualifying in the race? When Verstappen returned to the track after the red flag, his feelings didn't improve, as evidenced by his radio comments. The Dutchman described a car that became completely unpredictable at key points on the circuit. The problem was clear. On corner entry, the RB21 tended to understeer, forcing him to turn in more than usual to get the car on track. But what made matters even more complicated was that, on the way out of those same corners, the behavior reversed, resulting in sudden oversteer, leaving him constantly correcting the steering. This instability meant Verstappen couldn't attack the curves with confidence and was forced to lift off prematurely, losing tenths of a second in each sector. Telemetry confirmed what Verstappen felt in the cockpit. The greatest loss of time was in the second sector, where slow, medium-speed corners require a solid aerodynamic platform and a car capable of maintaining traction on exit. In these areas, the RB21 simply lacked the necessary balance. The rear end of the car seemed to disappear during quick steering transitions, forcing Max to correct with reflexes more like those of a karting driver than a Formula One driver. These types of constant corrections not only affect pace, they also undermine confidence and force a driver like Verstappen, who is used to always pushing the limit, to contain his natural aggression. Most worrying for Red Bull was that these symptoms were not isolated to the Baku track, but a repetition of the same problems that have appeared throughout the 2025 season. The fundamental aerodynamic imbalance of the RB21 became more evident on these types of street circuits, where there is no room for error and where every corner demands a predictable car. Verstappen, far from sounding annoyed, was meticulous in his observations, detailing how the car jumped on the curbs and how traction was lost on corner exit. That feedback reflected the level of frustration, but also the technical clarity with which the Dutchman is addressing the team's problems. All of this meant that the start of the weekend exposed a Red Bull with serious limitations in the very heart of the circuit. What in other years was a dominant car capable of adapting quickly, in Baku seemed like a car forced to fight against itself on every lap. For Verstappen, this meant not only dealing with his rivals, but also with a car that refused to perform in the most basic track conditions. The second free practice session in Baku didn't bring the recovery that many had hoped for Verstappen and Red Bull. On the contrary, the situation worsened, leaving an even more worrying feeling in the pit box. Max could only finish in 6th place, with a time of 1 minute and 41.902 seconds, more than 0.6 of a second behind Lewis Hamilton, who surprisingly led the field for Ferrari. The most striking aspect wasn't just his position on the leaderboard, but the clear evidence that, even with more track time and improved performance on the asphalt, the RB21 was still showing the same limitations that had emerged in the first practice session. In the first sector, the Dutchman once again suffered from the car's lack of consistency. The curbs in the Old Town area proved to be an impossible obstacle to manage. Every time he hit the curb, the car lifted off the ground and lost contact with the asphalt, forcing him to lift off and losing confidence to push to the limit. This situation is critical in Baku because the curbs are a natural part of the fast line, and avoiding them means sacrificing time on every lap. The car's inability to absorb the track's irregularities exposed the excessive stiffness of the front suspension, a problem Red Bull has been plagued with all season. In the second sector, the medium-speed corners accentuated another of the RB21's most serious weaknesses, the loss of downforce at the rear during rapid changes of direction. Verstappen reported over the radio that the rear end was moving more than expected at each transition, forcing him to constantly correct and sapping his confidence. For a driver who bases his aggressiveness on the ability to fully trust the car's stability, this lack of rear grip represents a psychological blow as well as a technical one. Telemetry confirmed that it was in this sector where Max lost most of his time against the leaders, demonstrating that the car's aerodynamic foundation was not up to the demands of the circuit. The most surprising thing was what happened in the third sector, where Red Bull has historically had an advantage due to its aerodynamic efficiency on the straight line. With a 2.2-kilometer main straight, Verstappen was expected to make up for some of what he lost in the technical sections, but the reality was different. The need to load more wing to give the car stability in corners had compromised top speed, leaving the RB21 at a disadvantage against Ferrari and McLaren. This was a severe blow because it showed that the team could no longer rely on even one of its traditional strengths. FP2 thus left one inescapable conclusion. Red Bull was in no position to compete for the top positions in Baku without finding a radical solution to its setup. Verstappen, despite his ability to adapt to any scenario, was limited by a car that didn't respond in any of the 3 sectors of the track. At that point, the priority no longer seemed to be the pursuit of pole position, but rather minimizing damage and ensuring the weekend didn't turn into an unmitigated disaster in terms of championship points. After 2 difficult sessions, Verstappen made his perception of what was happening in Baku clear. The Dutchman spoke frankly and bluntly, acknowledging that this type of circuit has never been the team's strong suit and that the problems were no surprise to him. He emphasized that the slow, 90-degree corners, along with the high curbs, have always exposed the car's weaknesses. What was most striking was that, far from being annoyed, he adopted a realistic, almost resigned tone, as if he knew in advance that the weekend was going to be an uphill climb. This change in discourse shows Verstappen aware of his car's limitations and willing to manage expectations. From the Red Bull pit box, the interpretation was very similar. Laurent Mekies, in his role as team principal, backed up this view with a pragmatic approach. The Frenchman insisted that the key was to remain calm and avoid the extreme course changes that had caused so much damage in the past. His philosophy focused on working with a more stable approach, maintaining consistent setups and learning from the data, even when the immediate results weren't optimal. This approach contrasted with what had been seen in previous seasons, when frustration led the team to introduce drastic modifications that ultimately worsened the situation. The overall feeling reflected a combination of frustration and acceptance. Frustration because Verstappen and Red Bull know that Baku is a track where they could once aspire to anything and now find themselves limited, and acceptance because, unlike on other occasions, they seemed willing to face reality without disguising it. Verstappen acknowledged that the car had improved since Monza, but also emphasized that each circuit is a different challenge, and that here the RB21's shortcomings were amplified. This type of messaging, although less triumphant, helps manage pressure both inside the garage and in front of the press, and demonstrates a change of mentality in the way problems are communicated. The team introduced some specific modifications for this track, such as new cooling vents on the front brakes and tweaks to the rear wing, intended to provide a bit more downforce without compromising straight-line speed. However, these improvements were considered more palliative than definitive solutions. Makis had made it clear that major updates would no longer be available in 2025, and that what remained was to work with what was available, getting the most out of a limited package. In other words, Red Bull's future lay in smart management, rather than a technical leap that would radically change the landscape. For Verstappen, the immediate challenge was to regain confidence in the car and adapt to its weaknesses. The Dutchman knows that on circuits like Baku, it's essential to stay focused and not push too hard, because mistakes can be costly on the narrow streets of the old town and in the hard-braking zones. His experience and ability to find the limit will be Red Bull's best tool to compensate for a car that isn't at its best. This is where the pilot has to make the difference, turning frustration into precision and disadvantage into endurance. In conclusion, the first 2 practice sessions in Baku made it clear that Max Verstappen and Red Bull are not having an easy weekend. 7th in the first session and 6th in the second, with a car that showed weaknesses in every sector, reflected that the RB21 is far from the solidity it had demonstrated on other circuits. What's striking isn't just the times, but the clarity with which the problems were exposed, lack of downforce, instability in slow corners, and a compromised top speed. The impact of his start in Baku isn't limited to Friday's result, it extends to what could happen in qualifying and the race, where every 10th of a second will be crucial. Now I ask you directly, do you think Verstappen can turn the weekend around and fight for a podium, or will this Grand Prix be another blow to Red Bull in its attempt to stay competitive? Leave me your opinion in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel.